Hello everybody and welcome to another devlog video for the procedural city generator. I wanted to make this quick video to show you guys my progress in the 1.2 update for PCG. And if you missed my last video, I kind of went over my whole plan for 2023 including PCG, but I'll just take a minute here and show you guys what I have in mind. So I have a Trello board here for PCG, and obviously you can see all of the previous releases here, everything that I've done. Right now, the next big update is the 1.2 update, which is this kind of list here. And I have all of the features that I like to add, what I'm working right now, which is what's in progress, and what's pretty much done for that release. And the really big ticket items are the ones in orange here, which are the epic user stories. So the things that I really want to focus on, if I can, for this big update is improving the sidewalk experience, using geometry scripting to add better sidewalks to your city, having support for megacities by using the world partition spawning grid, adding support for modular buildings, which is now something that is way more feasible with Nanite, adding support for chaos destruction. In UE4, I had some blueprints that would help you use apex destruction. Now that it's been deprecated, we need to use chaos. And finally, if I can, adding multiplayer support for all of the relevant blueprint nodes. And there's other things like improved water detection, etc. So what I'm currently working on is world partition and sidewalks. And for this video, I wanted to show you guys my progress with world partition. It is not fully implemented yet, but I wanted to show you guys kind of the beginnings of what I have in mind for world partition. Get your feedback and hear what you have to say. If you've been using world partition, obviously I really want to hear from you. So all right, so let's go ahead and jump into Unreal. And right here I have a very simple map. This is a default open world map, which means that it comes automatically with a landscape and with world partition enabled. So if I go here to the world settings, there's going to be a world partition tab here or section. I can go down here and I can enable the grid. So if I click preview grid, you can see that we have here, I'm going to zoom down a little bit faster. You can see that we have the grid that is available there. So I'm going to put the loading range to an extra 0 so we can see everything. And there you go. And that should be the world partition grid. What it means is that any object that is placed in individual cells will be automatically loaded and unloaded as the player or streaming source moves around the world, which is great. We're going to spawn all our buildings and props, and they're going to line up to specific grids, and world partition would automatically make sure that things are loaded and unloaded. So in concept, it's a very simple thing, but trying to align the buildings and spawn the buildings to match the grid is really the more challenging part. And if you notice, as I'm moving the camera, the grid seems to be moving along because it's reprojecting the grid in a perspective camera. Unfortunately, if I change to like a top view of the world, it does not show the grid. This would be probably the easiest way of doing it because then the grid will be perfectly aligned and we can just like align it that way. But it's not showing here and we have to work with what we have. It only shows on perspective, which means that if I place an object somewhere, as I'm moving along, you're going to see that the grid kind of shifts and turns, and it's not necessarily, you can kind of see the effect there, it's not necessarily as easy to align things. So my idea for PCG is that I want to be able to spawn our city in such a way that you can spawn individual cells in world partition, and then you can load and unload those cells and continue to work. So if I go to the world partition tab here, you can see that we have the cells that are already shown here. So ideally, we want to create a city where you can select individual cells and say, hey, I want to spawn my city in these 4 cells here. For example, you spawn your buildings, you spawn your foliage, your props, you save your map, and then you unload these cells here, and then you choose another 4 cells. And theoretically, there's no size limit at that point because you don't have the entire city in memory. So that is kind of my idea. So here's what we have so far. So I have I've spawned my relevant blueprints here. I'm going to create a new city. Let's call this cell city, for example, which I already had it here as before. I'm going to go ahead and create the city. I'm going to spawn my city limits. and automatically you see that my city limits are pretty big, which is fine. If I go to my world partition grid, I'm trying to see where my city limits align, but I don't see them here. And that is because you have to save your level. I'm going to click save here before you're going to see whatever actors you have selected in the grid view here. You can see them here in yellow. So the first thing we want to do is we want to align the city limits to the grid. So I'm going to move my city limits to match with, I'm going to choose this cell here as my beginning for my city. So I'm going to choose it here, and I'm going to move it here, and I can zoom in here to make sure that we try to align it. So as you can see, there is no, unfortunately, perfect programmatic way that I can align it. It's going to be a little bit of manual alignment here. But now that I have these two corners aligned, I can see that my city is basically going to be this size. And I'm going to save this again. And my city is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to align to a 5 by 5 grid, starting with the top left right here. I'm going to load the cell. And I'm actually going to load all of my cells here. Make sure that everything is loaded. And now I'm going to spawn my road connectors, and I'm going to choose the same process that I've done before. I'm going to do it pretty quickly here. My point is not to create like the nicer city or whatever, just to show you guys what we need to do here. I'm going to spawn a city zone, and I'm going to choose my zone here, and I'm going to make this pretty big. So like 2000, oops, by 2000. Which basically means it's going to cover the whole thing. We don't really care much about that right now. I'm going to make this invisible. And I'm going to go to the roads, and I'm going to spawn my connecting roads. And I'm going to spawn some main roads here. All right, we'll just leave it there. I'm going to go ahead and save our level. And now if we go back to the world partition, and again, make sure that everything is loaded. If I select any of these roads, you can see that we have the bounds of the roads, which it looks like a volume here, that are right now represented inside the grid. So now what we want to do is we want to spawn our buildings according to the cell. And if you recall from some of my previous devlogs, we already have a system in the building called a spawning volume. And we can do that by spawning this volume in our level and only spawning our buildings, props, and foliage inside that volume. That system is already there. So my idea was simply to have the ability to spawn these spawning volumes that match each individual cell, and then you can choose which spawning volumes will be active and then spawn your buildings there. So as you can see here, we already had the general tab, we had road management, and I've added another tab here called world partition. And when we click there, this is only the things that we have right now. We need to spawn our volume manager. That's a separate blueprint, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that volume manager basically is going to manage the grid of volumes that is going to match our cells here. And I'm going to select my volume manager, and I'm going to move it to the top left corner of where our city starts. So I'm going to save it here so I can see the volume manager here. And I know that this is the first cell of my city, so I need to kind of align it so it matches that cell. And I'm not going to spend too much time trying to get it completely perfect here, but you have the idea of how this needs to be aligned. And notice that the size is exactly the same, and I did that by default, but you can change the size, right? So if you look at the world settings, you can see that the cell size right now by default is 25,600 units. And if I go to my spawn volume, by default, I've changed the size of the volume to be 12,800, which is the extent that is half of the size of the cell. And because I have the exact same size as the default grid or cell size, is going to match exactly right here. If you were to change the size here for your world partition, then of course you would have to come here and change the size of your rectangle extent for your spawn volume. But right now we're going to leave everything by default because I'm assuming you're just testing this and you're going to leave the cells to be the same size. And now all we need to do is we want to spawn a grid of 5 by 5 to match our city limits. And we can do that by clicking spawn volume grid here. And you can see that as soon as I do that, I spawn a bunch of volumes in the X and the Y axis. I have some specific identifiers here. And then if I click save, this grid of volumes now matches the specific cell. So if I click on this volume here, the 2-1, oops, the actual grid, so the spawn volume, you can see that this spawn volume matches this cell right here. And if I click on 2-1 here, you'll see here, it's a little bit hard to see probably by the recording, but you can see the faint yellow line that it is matching this cell. And if I do the 1-1, you can see that it matches this cell, and 0-1, it matches this cell, etc. So as I'm clicking the individual volumes here, I am actually matching the world partition grid. So now all we need to do is activate or deactivate which parts of our grid we want to activate to spawn our buildings. And you can see that I'm programmatically creating buttons for each individual cell in the grid. So if we, in this case, we're doing a 5x5, so that's what we have. It can be something as big as 100x100 if you're doing a ridiculously big city. But let's say that we wanted to spawn buildings, let's say in 1-1 and 2-1. So we can just come here and click 1-1 and 2-1, and you can see that I'm changing the colors. Out of the entire grid, we want to work only with these two cells. We click apply settings, and notice that these two cells now become active. In this case, I just changed the color to green. Then I go back to general settings. I'm going to reset the batch, and I'm going to spawn my road buildings. And I've only spawned buildings only on these two active spawn volumes, which again match specific cells in world partition. Let's say that I'm happy with this. I'm going to go back to world partition and say, okay, now I want to spawn buildings in, let's say, in 3-2, for example. So I'm going to click on 3-2 to activate, and I'm going to deactivate 1-1 and 2-1. I'm going to apply settings. And now the only thing active is here. These buildings are there. I'm not going to touch them. Then I can go back to general settings. I'm going to go ahead and reset the batch again and spawn my road buildings. And now the buildings have spawned here in this area here. And now I've spawned in 3 different cells. I'm going to go ahead and save my level here. And now, theoretically, those buildings are going to be specifically attached to a cell, and they're going to load and unload automatically. Now, I'm not there yet. And what's going to happen is if I zoom in here, you can see that the grid keeps moving. But if I say I'm going to do this, which is the 3-2, is going to be this cell here, right here. If I choose this cell to unload, I'm going to load everything first. If I choose this cell, which is this 3-2, and I unload it, unload selected cell, notice that not all the buildings are unloaded. Only some are unloaded. Load selected cells. You can see that there's an issue here. This is something that I'm still working out. I believe part of it is because world partition is using the bounds of the object, which are a lot larger. So for example, if I click this building here, you'll notice that it's way larger compared to this. That's probably because of the interior building, the volume that I use, which is pretty large to spawn the interiors, which is why world partition is saying, hey, the bounds are outside of the cell. I cannot unload it. That is a possibility. Another possibility is because there's a lot of connections between spatially loaded and non-spatially loaded assets. Meaning, for example, the roads will not be loaded and unloaded as part of the cell. And that's because usually roads are going to be crossing multiple cells. So the rows are not going to be using world partition. Our buildings and props are. But the buildings do have an assigned road. So if there's a reference between something that needs to be loaded and unloaded and something that is always loaded, world partition is going to have some issues with that as well. So there's a lot of little intricacies that I still have to work on to make sure that this setup works. But hopefully you get the general point of where I'm going with this. But the general workflow would be that you generate the grid here with these buttons, and then you work on specific sections of the city. You can choose a specific corner. You spawn all your buildings, you spawn your props, your foliage, you do everything you need to do. You save it, then you unload those cells via world partition here, and then you load the next cells that you're going to be working on. And with that method, theoretically, you could have a absolute monster city of hundreds of kilometers. And because you're not working on the city all at once, you can work on as many cells as your computer will allow, having a city with theoretically no upper limit as far as size. So this is kind of what I have right now. I'm pretty happy with my progress. This is the fun part, all of the front end stuff. The hard part, or the boring part, is figuring out things like all of these error messages that I'm getting, right? Because of world partition, because a spatially loaded actor like city generator is referencing a non-spatially loaded actor like a main road. All of these things have to be solved one way or another if I want this to actually work properly. But as you can see right now, at least half of the buildings are not unloading properly. So that needs to be fixed for 1.2. But this is what I have so far. So what do you think? Do you think my approach is the better approach? Do you think you can see yourself working with world partition and spawning your cities in that way? Do you have any suggestions? If you work with world partition more, you probably have, because I'm just kind of digging into this now. Any suggestions, comments, I would really appreciate it. And yeah, I will continue working on this and trying to fix these issues, and I'm going to improve the UI part here with some additional options like the cell size, etc. And I will let you guys know how it goes through a future devlog. But before that, I will probably show you guys my progress with the sidewalks. That's probably going to be the next devlog, hopefully fairly soon. So stay tuned. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And thank you guys so much for all of your support. All right, I'll see you guys in the next video.